Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story will welcome back the incredible mind of our brother, RICOstories, with a sequel to the hugely successful Bloodlands storyline. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled The Mountain King. Let's get straight into that. Prologue. From the lands of Meshach and Tibble, he came to conquer. Part 1. Umskibt Vindur, the changing wind. More than 15 years have passed since Bjorn and Lizzy returned from their battle with monsters and giants in the mysterious Mediterranean island. They chose their love for each other to become average people who could have a family. But these two were far more than average people. Bjorn still possessed great strength and what some refer to as a sixth sense. After his return, he was appointed a captain of the King's Guard and trained the troops and served for more than 4 years. Lizzy still possessed superior riding and archery skills and taught the soldiers as well. Between the two, Bjorn and Lizzy had prepared the best trained army in the lands. Queen Olivia had married Gerard, the former captain of the guard, after her father King Philip knighted him. They ruled justly, and the people now prospered. Queen Olivia's kinspeople had even sent their troops to be trained by Bjorn and Lizzy. The desire, though, to become simple farmers and work the family land was a dream Bjorn and Lizzy shared that had now come to fruition, as Bjorn was now 33 and Lizzy was 32. And after 2 years of training soldiers, Lizzy returned to her mother's farm to again raise horses, and Bjorn was now farming his father's land. And Lizzy bore Bjorn 2 healthy, beautiful children. There was young Eric, now almost 15, and little Gretchen, aged 10, named after Bjorn's little brother and sister who were taken by the Bloodlands horns. The Bloodlands again had vegetation, and people from the Norman village had vineyards there. The only piece of land still red was a large boulder near the top of the hill, where Father David had built a new church. A young priest named Daniel now led a growing congregation of practitioners, and Father David and several villagers were to install the first church bell to be rung on the next Sabbath. It was a sunny, temperate autumn day, as Bjorn ready for another harvest. Several of his employees from the ever-growing Norman village seemed preoccupied as they discussed the recent earth tremors that had been felt as far south as the outlying kingdom pastures. Bjorn interrupted his foreman, Lars, to ask what was being discussed. Lars responded that the old village volva, or witch, was saying that Jontuk Kongen was awakening from a long sleep. Some farms in the foothills of the mountain had lost a few sheep, and there was still talk of trolls emerging from deep caves and taking them. Bjorn paused and said, most likely these are wolves taking the sheep, and it may be time for us to have a huge hunt to thin the pack after the harvest is over. Bjorn turned to see young Eric a few feet behind him. He had overheard the conversation as he was about to board the wagon to take hay to the horses. He was a tall, strapping lad, over 6 feet with broad shoulders, and looked a lot like Bjorn, but had his mother's red hair. He had a look of concern about what he had just heard. Part 2. Paradis Oseati. Paradise Disturbed. After coming home from the Mediterranean, Bjorn would periodically have dreams he and the Gagori. Sometimes Lizzy would find him up late at night holding his sword or shield. But for the last 2 years or so, those dreams had increased to almost weekly. Lizzy would embrace him and say, "My darling, what is wrong? Tell me about the dreams." He would just say that he was reliving past experiences through his dreams and not to worry. But just before the recent earth tremors began, he had several dreams about a gigantic rock on top of the mountain, surrounded by many smaller rocks, and they were all tumbling downhill. He awoke to the sound and smell of Lizzy making breakfast, and arose to see young Eric already at the table, with Gretchen rubbing her eyes and staggering to the table. And Bjorn gave them all a big hug and sat down. and Eric spoke. "Father, my 15th birthday is approaching. Will you take me on the big wolf hunt after the harvest?" Bjorn responded, "Yes, my son. You are almost a man and already a fine hunter." "Father, do you think we will see any trolls on the hunt?" Gretchen stopped eating and looked at her mother with weary eyes, as Bjorn responded, "Nonsense. Where are you hearing this?" "Lars and the harvest workers talk about what the Volva is saying." And Lizzy said, "You can't believe that old witch. He stays drunk on mead or high on the mountain herbs," as she placed an assuring hand on Gretchen's shoulder. There was now 2 days left to complete the harvest and fill their stores, and then take the rest to market. It would be 2 long, hard days of work from daylight to dark, as a full harvest moon shone above. At night, you could hear the wolves calling out from the mountains, as the workers nervously made their way home. Bjorn again had the dream about the mountain, but this time he saw a terrible face on the huge rock, and his mouth opened, emitting a blood-curdling sound, while a hot wind rushed at him. The final day was here, and the work began just as the eastern sky showed light. As the horse-drawn wagons were slowly pulled through the fields, the workers cut and baled as others loaded the wagons. No more than 2 hours after the workday started, the ground began to rumble under their feet, and the horses had to be restrained. A roar echoed from the mountain, and the workers ran for the protection of the trees. Within seconds, the event was over, but it had shaken almost everyone. That is, everyone but Bjorn. Several workers talked about leaving, and Bjorn spoke. "Calm down. You men are Vikings. Your forefathers settled here, near volcanoes, and built homes on shaken ground. Let's finish this work and go to your families with a generous payday." And the workers slowly went back to work and finished their tasks, working until after the full moon shone. Bjorn hurried in for a quick supper and told young Eric to prepare for a trip to the Norman village. This excited Eric, but Lizzy objected. "It is late and you have worked since before dawn. Why must you go? Is it not time to rest?" Bjorn sighed. I must go see Harold and talk to the old Volva," he said. And Lizzy bit her tongue and scowled at Bjorn as he told Eric to get his bow and sword, perchance they should encounter wolves. As they mounted the wagon and drove off, Eric asked his father what he would talk to the Volva about. "My son, there are many things your mother and I haven't told you about our lives before you were born. From this day forward, we must train you to be strong in faith and skilled in the old ways of combat. I am going to talk to the old Volva about some dreams I'm having, and hopefully discover why he speaks of trolls and what he knows about these disturbances within the earth." Part 3. Voluspa. End and Beginning. It was late as Bjorn and Eric entered the gate of the Norman village. They turned onto a dimly lit path and made their way up to the residence of Bjorn's old friend, Harold, one of the village elders. The door opened wide before Bjorn could knock, and Harold reached out to embrace him. "Welcome, my old friend," he said. "And look at young Eric, a man in his own right already. Come in and sit." "We cannot stay long," said Bjorn. "I need you to go with me to visit the old Volva." And Harold frowned and said, "I knew a day like this would come again." Harold got his cloak and mounted the wagon with Bjorn and Eric. On the way, they chatted about the earth tremors and the missing sheep. One farmer reported seeing something that looked like a bear but walked upright taking the sheep. But it was at night during rain and fog. Nobody else had seen it, but close to a dozen sheep or goats had disappeared. Eric listened intently as they pulled up to the old shed with a thatched roof and a dim light coming from within. It looked as if it belonged in a graveyard, and a dank musty smell emanated from within. They all dismounted and walked slowly to the door. Before Bjorn could even knock, a hoarse voice said, "Is this Bjorn the farmer, or Bjorn the archer, warrior, who comes seeking my counsel?" The old voice now trembled a bit as he said, "Enter, my old friends." And Harold slowly swung open the door. The Volva's old cloudy eyes fixed on Bjorn from the dark corner where he sat, and he motioned for them to sit. As they entered, a slight smile cracked his old wrinkled face, and he said,
Bjorn the Fearless, the last time I saw you, you were with your father, and about the age of your son. This future, Aranar.
Bjorn's brow wrinkled, and Eric's face was puzzled to say the least, as the Volva asked Bjorn if he had brought an appropriate tribute. And from inside Bjorn's cloak, he pulled a bottle filled with a dark liquid. He handed it to the old man as his gnarled fingers struggled to remove the cork. He took his first swig, and a look of pleasure replaced the frown on his face.
You remembered, said the old man. My favorite elixir that your father used to bring to me. Now, what can I do for you noble Vikings?
Bjorn spoke.
These stories of trolls you've been telling, and some dreams I'm having. I want to know if they are related.
The Volva took another swig and then a deep breath before hesitating for a moment. He spoke with a rhyme proclaiming,
The earth holds a terrible thing within. When it is expelled, a horror will begin, as creatures underground unsettled come craving flesh and bone. For the sins of the past we must atone.
And Bjorn asked,
What is this thing the earth holds?
The old man leaned forward with a face of stone and said,
Shatan Konga, king of the mountain, the ancient one.
Harold and Bjorn looked at each other with great concern as the old witch continued.
And you dream of the mountain with eyes to see and a mouth to speak, surrounded by many smaller rocks in a whirlwind.
Bjorn's eyes opened wide, and the old Volva said,
Bjorn, this is your destiny. My body is weak. I don't have much time left, but you must see this through.
And the old man leaned back in his chair and took a deep, long breath and went to sleep. And they departed for the short trip back to Harold's house. Eric could hardly wait to ask questions. Father, what did he mean when he called you a Vainja warrior? Why did he call me an Ranar? What does it all mean? Bjorn and Harold looked at each other, and Harold spoke.
He called your father a winged warrior, and said you would be one day like an eagle.
Bjorn was silent, but somehow he had a feeling that even his son was part of something he didn't yet understand. And as they arrived at Harold's house, he looked at Bjorn and said,
For more than 15 years we have had peace. Some claimed there would one day be a price to pay. I feel that day it is at hand.
He dismounted the wagon, looking at young Eric with a smile, and said,
Good luck, young eagle.
And as Bjorn and Eric drove home, Eric was quiet for a time, and then said, Father, I have had dreams about a large man with a sword and shield. He wears a cloak with a hood obscuring his face. He stands in fog, and I think 2 others stand behind him. He reaches out his hands, holding a bundle to give to me, but I cannot make out what it is. Bjorn fell silent and said,
My son, there is much for us to discuss, and things I must show you in the coming days. Your mother and I weren't always exactly as we appeared to be, and that is especially true for me.
Part 4. Retir Daltinder, the Mountain Storm. Let's get straight into that. As Bjorn and family awoke the following morning, dark clouds loomed in the distance, and they would have to work fast to get the harvest to market. Bjorn said to Eric,
My son, when we return home from this day's work, your mother and I will have much to discuss.
And they hurriedly finished breakfast and joined the workers already in the fields. Now the wagons were loaded high and lashed down, as even Lizzy and Gretchen mounted a wagon to drive to the palace grounds. And as the evening skies became even darker, thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning danced across the mountain tops. A line of wagons from different farms rolled onto the grounds and pulled under shelters for the big sale tomorrow. Father David came to greet Bjorn and family, talking of just how big Eric had grown.
Bjorn, Lizzy, please come into the chapel and join us for a meal.
It was evening as they sat down to eat. Father David blessed their meal. They ate and chatted while catching up on local events. Then the moon turned dour as young Eric mentioned the trip to visit the Volva. Father David paused and said,
Yes, there is an anxiety hanging over the country as the old witch talks of dark times.
And then Lizzy spoke up. Father, both Bjorn and Eric have had dreams as of late. And Father David bowed his head and said,
Yes, Bjorn and his cryptid, but prophetic dreams.
At that point, Father David asked Sister Angela to come and take young Gretchen to play with her for a while. And there was silence in the room as faint thunder rumbled in the distance. And Father David listened intently as Bjorn relayed his dream about the mountain and his trip to visit the Volva. Then Eric told of his dream about the large man in a haze with a hooded face holding an unknown bundle. The father looked at Eric and began telling the story of how he found Bjorn as a baby wrapped in an impenetrable cloak next to a strange sword. Bjorn shared the real story about how his parents and siblings were killed. Then Lizzy told her unfortunate story with King Dorian and Count Vostok as tactfully as possible. Young Eric's eyes opened wide as Bjorn told of his first angelic transformation after wearing the cloak and holding the sword. And as they finished the stories of their adventures with the giant wolves and their trip to the mysterious island, Eric remained silent for a moment and then said, Somehow, I know this is all involving me. I just feel it inside me that I'm part of it. And Father David hesitated and said,
There is something I must tell you all. It is a legend that is part myth and part biblical. Long ago, it is said that Alexander the Great and his troops pursued a cannibal giant onto the mountains to the far north. In Arabic, it is called Yajuj Majuj. In Hebrew, it is known as Gog Magog. He who will bring the apocalypse in the end times. It killed 1/3 of Alexander's men as they chased it into the deep canyon during an intense storm. 2/3 of the remaining troops divided and went on top of the canyon walls, as Alexander led a third after the behemoth. Try they did to push enough heavy rocks to cause a landslide, trapping the monster, but they were to no avail, until miraculously an immense bolt of lightning struck the far end of the canyon, sending down mountains of rocks from all sides. A huge hole engulfed the giant, and there it is said to remain for centuries. Some believe it was dead. Some say it is merely trapped and in a state of slumber. And at that instant a rumble was felt coming from the ground, and it was much stronger than those previously felt at the palace grounds, as walls shook and things fell from shelves. Bjorn said, We must ride fast to the village and check on our people. Lizzy asked Father David to please look after Gretchen. Bjorn said, Lizzy, my darling, please go with Father David to notify the king's guard and bring men prepared for whatever awaits. Eric will be at home preparing our weapons. And she threw her arms around him, saying, Come back to me, my husband. He nodded, and then he and Eric hurriedly departed. Now, upon arrival at the ranch, there was a handful of farm workers there who had come looking for Bjorn. Lars and Arnie clamoured about what was happening to the north of the village. Reports were coming in of the Dovregubben, or large trolls attacking livestock and people in the countryside. The creatures would surely be upon the village shortly. And Bjorn said, Inside, quickly, and let us properly arm you. Today you are not farmers, you are Vikings. And Bjorn ushered Eric inside and pulled up some boards in the floor. He emerged with his cloak, shield, and sword. Eric stared and reached out, touching the shield. For just a moment, he was in a trance-like state when Bjorn shouted, Son, your mother will be along shortly. You must pass along the news and ride for the village. Part 5. Raua Bruni Istal. Blood, Fire, and Steel. It was now midnight as Bjorn and his men arrived in the middle of the Norse village to chaos, with women and children loaded in wagons and being ferried away. And there stood Harold
with about 30 men armed and ready.
"What can you tell me?"
said Bjorn. Another 30 able-bodied men stand prepared to the north to meet the foul trolls that had ravaged our people and stock since nightfall. They stand ready with fire and steel to repel them. An older man behind Harold, named Gustav, said,
"These abominations love goats and they love cheese. We will distract them with that and rain fire upon them."
Then Bjorn said,
"I suggest you divide your men to flank left and right, so you may cut off any who penetrate and ambush them in the center, and we will try to get behind them."
"Very good," said Harold, and raised his sword, saying,
"My fellow Vikings, tonight either heaven, hell, or Valhalla awaits us."
The men cheered and charged toward whatever awaited. Arnie, who was almost as big as Bjorn, spoke.
"So, what shall we do?" "Get torches and pitch, then ride north with me across the river bridge and over the ridge where the battle awaits."
Only a few miles away, Lizzy and Eric rode towards the front of the King's Guard alongside Captain Svensson, who was personally trained by Bjorn. Lizzy bore her double short swords upon her back once again and carried her deadly, accurate bow. And as they made their way north, leading 40 of the finest in the guard, thunder and lightning grew stronger and rain fell. They met the wagons full of women, children, and the elderly. Harold's wife Astrid slowed to a stop, telling them of the fateful events and that Bjorn had arrived just as they departed. Captain Svensson told those in wagons to make haste for the palace grounds and to stop for nothing. He turned in his saddle and said, "Noble guard, we ride like wind to the village." Upon arrival, they discovered some dead and wounded men. "Give me a report," said Svensson. A man with part of his arm missing stood and said, "The Dovre Gruben overran us. We killed or wounded many, but they were too strong, too big, and too ferocious. Some devoured our people on the spot, but they will burn with enough fire." Eric leaned over to whisper in Lizzy's ear, "Mother, I feel compelled to see the Vova, as if he is calling to me to say something." Captain Svensson ordered his men to break into elements of 10 and spread out with torches lit while the rain had subsided. Lizzy told the captain that they were seeking out the Vova. He nodded, and the men rode forward. Bjorn and his men rode alongside the river until they came to the bridge.
"We cross here, men. Light torches and stand by with arrows. Something doesn't feel right."
The bridge was small, and they made their way across 2 at a time for fear that they might not hold the weight and they fall into the rushing water. And as the 6th and final rider crossed the bridge, a large hand and arm shot out from underneath, grabbing the last man off of his horse. He barely had time to scream as he was pulled under. Bjorn barked at Arnie to go left while he went right and lit an arrow. The remaining men backed them up with torches blazing, and there it was, a hideous troll about 10 feet in height and with large ears, sharp spiked teeth, and red eyes. It had already bit the head off of the unfortunate man. It made a guttural growl at Bjorn when, from the other side of the bridge, Arnie had waded to his knees and fired a flaming arrow, striking the creature in its shoulder blade. It dropped the headless body into the rushing water as its flesh started to blaze. It turned to pursue Arnie as Bjorn lit up the side of its face with another arrow. It now emerged from under the bridge, growling and slapping at its face and hide. And just as it could make a leap for the river, Bjorn's sword severed its head. Bjorn retrieved the head and tied it upon the back of their spare horse.
"My brothers, we will use this to our advantage. Now, we ride!"
Part 6. Danger Ahead. A perilous journey. Lizzy and Eric rode up the rain-washed path to the old Vova's shack. They arrived and dismounted to see that part of the roof was gone and the place was totally dark, except for a small candlelight. Eric and Lizzy dismounted and drew swords before gently swinging open the old tattered door. The old man lay on his bed, wet and shivering from the rain that had come through his roof. Eric leaned down and said, Are you okay? A weak, hoarse voice responded.
Do I look well? I am on my deathbed.
I felt as if you were beckoning me here, said Eric. The old witch nodded and motioned for he and Lizzy to draw closer.
As unchristian beings, trolls are said to suffer severe head pain due to their large ears when they hear church bells. They may even lose rationale and become unable to function or run away. Trolls are also repelled by lightning, which kills them, likely a result of their run-ins with Thor, who is said to have slayed many across the land. Some legends attest that trolls turn to stone when exposed to sunlight, but it is fire and high-pitched noise that affects them most. You must both ride like Valkyrie to the chapel and ring the new church bell.
He gasped for air and reached for the bottle Bjorn had brought him. Lizzy lifted his head and put the bottle to his lips, and he drank down the last swallow. The grimace left his face for just an instant as he took a breath to speak.
Lizzy, tonight much of your power will be restored, and you, young eagle, will have your first test for the man who wears the hood.
Eric pleaded. What test? Who is the man in the hood? But it did no good, as the old witch gasped and took his last breath. Lizzy pulled at Eric and said, Come on, son. We know what we must do. And Bjorn and his men were now on top of the ridge, overlooking the first contact between the trolls and the villagers. A few torches lay strewn on the ground along with bodies both human and troll. After they made their way down the rocky path, Bjorn said,
Check for survivors and collect any weapons and unused pitch and torches.
And as they crept forward towards the tree line, two large, white, lumbering figures emerged, running straight for them.
Fire!
Said Bjorn, as they loosed their flaming arrows, striking one to the left in the chest and setting it ablaze. The two men to the right weren't so lucky, as they had trouble lighting the arrowheads, and the ugly creature slammed into them. It picked one man up, opening its massive jaws, and bit down onto his head, when a sword swung down, beheading it. And Arnie screamed,
5 more approaching fast,
as the beast barreled towards them. They each barely had time to fire an arrow when the trailing two erupted in flames from behind. Bjorn charged towards the center one, sliding under it and disemboweling it. Arnie slid and cut one off at the knee, causing it to tumble violently. And just as the two remaining men fired their flaming arrows, the trolls were upon them. One slashed at the man's chest, while the other was picked up, about to have his head bit off, when more flaming arrows struck from the rear, igniting the creatures. It was Harold and the remainder of his men. Harold was beat and bloody, but fit enough to run towards Bjorn and embrace him.
What happened?
Said Bjorn.
The first line was mostly overrun because the heavy rain prevented many from lighting torches and arrows. It seemed that about half of our ranks survived with several wounded. Aye, said Bjorn. We lost a man from a troll hidden under the river bridge.
We must see to the wounded and gather up what we can for a hasty trip back to the village, said Harold.
What of Lizzy and Eric?
Said Bjorn. They were with the troops from the King's Guard.
I'm sorry, my friend. They did not arrive before we left.
Bjorn's brow raised as a thunderous roar echoed down the valley, causing several men to soil themselves.
What in the name of creation was that?
Said Arnie, as Bjorn's keen eyes saw something atop of the hill in the distance. Then, from the tree line, emerged the King's Guard, having lost a fourth of their men. Captain Svensson told Bjorn that Eric and Lizzy sought out the old Volva's advice before rejoining us. But they have not seen them. Another roar came from atop the valley, and trees could be heard crashing in the distance.
What is it?
Said Svensson.
One of Harold's men said, It is the Jotun Kongen, the Mountain King.
And the terrible dread was now in the air, and brave men that had faced off trolls now wanted to flee as the thud, thud of heavy footsteps approached, shaking the ground under their feet.
Bjorn spoke. Listen to me, Vikings. You must fall back and make large fires to repel the beasts, and stand ready with all of your weapons. Somebody must ride back to the palace and warn the king. I am going to try and lead this abomination into the box canyon, where you may join me, and we will rain fire and boulders upon it. Now go, and if you see my family, tell them I love them."
And Harold and Svensson and Arnie nodded, and they headed out. Part 7. Valhalla awaits. Let's get straight into that. Eric and Lizzy rode hard for the chapel to ring the bell. Lizzy led the way because her vision had suddenly become keener, and as they approached the shallow fjord of the stream, 2 large hairy beasts charged from the trees. Eric's horse fell, throwing him to the ground with a thud and knocking him breathless for an instant. Lizzy quickly fired arrows at their faces, striking one in the eye and the other in the forehead, impacting his thick skull but not penetrating. The trolls screamed with rage and charged Lizzy as she rolled off the horse, drawing her swords. And just as the troll started to take a swipe at Lizzy, young Eric ran his sword through the creature's lower right side, causing it to turn with a powerful backhand and knocking him flat. It tried unsuccessfully to reach behind itself to pull out the sword. Lizzy took this opportunity to mount its back and plunge both swords down each side of its neck. She pulled out the blades and jumped away gracefully as a feline, while the creature crumpled. As she approached Eric, he was up and righting himself. Lizzy spoke sternly and admonished Eric not to linger near a large beast after a sword attack. "You must always stay fleet of foot, my son." And he nodded and said, "Yes, mother." Eric went to mount his horse and discovered its leg was broken. Lizzy said, "Take the reins of my horse and I will mount up behind you, so I may turn and fire behind us. Draw your sword and be ready." And Bjorn picked up a large lance on the ground and a kettle with pitch and rode for an advantage to attack the massive giant and force it to give pursuit. As he approached, he could see that this creature's head was among the tall tree's limbs as it walked. He spoke aloud.
"God Almighty, I could use the help of my warrior brothers right now."
And he adjusted his shield and fastened his helmet, apprehensive but hoping that he would again transform as he had done so many years ago. But as he rode, nothing happened. Unknown to Bjorn, Harold and his people were about to be hit by another wave of trolls, preventing them from giving assistance to Bjorn. They again set massive fires that had almost been quenched by earlier rains. And as they gathered pitch and more arrows, someone called out,
"Stand ready! A horde of trolls comes rapidly."
Bjorn rode into the behemoth's path and dismounted to soak his arrows in pitch, and used his torch to light the kettle and fling it into the giant's path.
It roared and said, "Who is this human to dare approach me? I am an ancient Assyrian demigod from the lineage of Japheth, grandson of Noah. I hail from the steppes of Gomorrah. The seed of the fallen lives in me. I have crushed many worms like you under my feet, and tonight I shall crush many more."
Bjorn placed the severed troll head on a spear and stuck it in the ground. He set it afire and loosed 2 flaming arrows at the giant, angering him, and said,
"First, you will have to catch me, you dim slug."
The monster roared and charged Bjorn as he rode away at full gallop towards the canyon. Now a battle raged outside the Norman village as Harold's men fought side by side with the king's guard against the trolls. The trolls threw rocks and tree limbs as the brave defenders fired flaming arrows and held kettles of fiery pitch. When a troll would catch fire, 2 or more men would hack away with swords. Eric and Lizzy now started up the hill with the chapel in sight. Suddenly, a shower of rocks pelted them as they rode on. Lizzy used her torch to light and unleash every arrow she had, but as trolls approached from both sides. More than halfway up the hill to the chapel, their horse was spooked and reared up when Lizzy shouted, "Jump, son, and ready your blade." And the village trolls ripped into men while being hacked and skewered with swords. Harold shouted, "Fall back! Behind the pitch pit!" Arnie and Svensson pressed 2 beasts and distracted them long enough for a few men to escape. As some men ran and some hobbled through a torch into the pitch pit, and a huge fireball erupted. 2 trolls caught fire, and the rest backed up and growled while looking for a way to attack. The men then hunkered down to shield themselves from the intense flames. A large troll closed in on Lizzy from the rear as she suddenly ducked and rolled under it, slashing its crotch with a sword. The beast howled in pain as the troll to the left charged at her. She continued to put the injured troll between her and her attacker while angling towards the chapel. Eric squared off with the beast to the right and slashed its arm as it took a swipe at him. The ugly creature screamed, and Eric dashed for the chapel, now not 100 feet away. Part 8. Heaven Seer. Vengeance from above. Let's get straight into that. Now suddenly boulder-sized rocks began to land in Bjorn as he neared the canyon. The giant had broken out of the forest and was running through the rocky field behind him. Suddenly, a huge rock struck the ground and shattered into pieces, with several striking the horse and Bjorn as they tumbled. Bjorn hit the ground hard and rolled up on his knees. His cloak protected him, but he was still hurt. The giant boomed with laughter, saying,
"You puny human! It took Alexander and a legion of his men to trap me, and I slew 1/3 of them. What do you think you can do alone?"
Suddenly Bjorn writhed with pain and bent over, clutching himself. A familiar blue light emanated from him as wings shot from his back. The giant paused in surprise at what he was seeing. Bjorn shot to his feet with his wings spread wide, standing ever taller and bigger than before. The giant chuckled and said,
"It will take more than one lone Grigori to defeat me."
Bjorn raised his sword as it shimmered with an intense blue flame and said,
"Fight you I will, you despicable abomination. Tonight your stench must be buried."
The giant crouched and started to lunge towards Bjorn when the sky opened, and 3 shafts of blue light struck the ground with a thunderous impact. A booming voice came from within the cloud of dirt and dust, saying,
"Nay, Assyrian, this night my brother will not fight you alone."
Now, Eric was almost to the door of the chapel when he saw the troll grab his mother. She screamed,
"My son, you must ring the bell."
He was conflicted. He could not leave her in the clinches of this beast, when suddenly the troll Eric wounded was upon him, and he fell back against the entrance. The beast then froze. It would not set foot on hallowed ground. Lizzy screamed again,
"Eric, you must ring the bell."
He threw open the doors to find Father Daniel praying at the altar and rushed past him, grabbing the rope to the bell tower. He began pulling a large rope as hard and as fast as he could. The bell rang loud and steady, and the 2 trolls outside began to cover their hideously large ears and shriek. They threw themselves on the ground and rolled in pain. And down at the village, the fire was beginning to burn down, and several angry trolls slowly advanced on the warriors. But the sound of the church bell began to reverberate throughout the valley. The trolls froze and put their hairy hands over their huge ears. Some began to whine or even cry. Some stumbled about, off balance, shrieking. Harold screamed, "Attack!" and the Vikings began dispatching the beasts. At the chapel, Lizzy was finishing off the remaining 2. And as the faint sound of the church bell reached them, the dusk cleared, and there stood Adonai, Simuel, and Chimuel. Adonai spoke, "Your mischief ends here, foul Nephilim. As I speak, 2 archangels guard the Babylonians' tomb and the cavern of the fallen who lay bound in great chains. You will be returned to your slumber until the appointed time."
"Alexander pursued me and prevented me from crossing over the protective ice wall. This time I shall not be denied. Not even the Lord of Spirits can destroy the serpent seed which lives within me."
And suddenly Bjorn flew at the giant's face, blinding it with the brilliant blue fire of his sword. And as Gog Magog threw up his arms to cover his eyes, Bjorn slashed his chest, causing him to roar so loud it shook the ground at the Norman village.
This night, my brethren, arise to feed on flesh, as I will feed on yours.
And Adoniel struck the giant on the head, causing him to cover the wound with one hand, and said, You prideful fool, the last of the trolls are almost dispatched. And Bjorn flew towards the cannon with his Grigori brothers darting in to slash at the monster from the rear and flanks. He screamed, I will crush you all. And Adoniel responded, You will not see the light of day again until the time of Wormwood, when the lands of Mekek and Tubal will march as one with the descendants of Cain. The giant roared, The fallen will once again prevail themselves upon human women, and our numbers will increase. And the cannon was now in sight as the behemoth swatted and grabbed at the Grigori. Part 9. Earning Your Wings. Eric continued ringing the bell to the point of exhaustion as two riders approached from the village. They waved their torches over their heads and screamed out, Sigra! Sigra! The Old Norse word for victory. Lizzy ran into the church and struggled to pull Eric away from the bell as he finally relinquished the rope and crumpled to the floor. Arnie burst in and grabbed Eric, shouting, We've done it! The beasts are slain! Lizzy gazed eastward, out of the church entrance, with a mindful eye in the direction of the thunderous sounds as the sun began to faintly light the horizon. Worried about Bjorn, she said, Come, we must ride to help Bjorn. And they headed in the direction of the village to collect more riders. The Grigori now lured the giants into the canyon as Adoniel suddenly shot upwards high above the canyon's end. He held his sword over his head as a fountain of blue fire burst upwards into the heavens. Dark clouds churned and thunder violently shook the ground. And as the riders departed the village, the horses bolted and some threw their riders. Suddenly, the twilight turned into day as a brilliant bolt of lightning struck the ground in the canyon, throwing huge rocks into the air. Bjorn and the Grigori covered with their shields as they were pelted. What could only be described as a huge bottomless pit now lay in the canyon as the giant staggered to regain his balance. Bjorn, Simuel, and Chimuel darted behind the giant while he was distracted, and all three slammed into his back full force with their shields pushing him over the edge into the pit. He roared with rage as he fell until out of sight. And as Harold and a couple of men righted themselves, they gazed at each other in wonder. As Lizzy approached, she cried out, What has happened? And Harold responded. In that instant of brilliant light, 'twas either thou cry or angels that swooped down upon the monster's head. And what of my father? Said Eric. Lizzy knew what they had seen and said, Be not concerned, my son. Your father is well. And at the canyon, a huge earthslide now filled the pit as the Grigori settled near the edge. Adoniel landed and said, Well done, my brothers, as they embraced each other. And Bjorn said, Thank you, my brethren. Simuel and Chimuel said farewell and shot upwards in shafts of blue light. Bjorn bowed his head and asked if he should say goodbye to his family. Adoniel smiled and replied, Your collective love and unwavering dedication gains you great favor with the Trinity. It is not yet your time. Now go to your family. Allow them to see you in this form for only a moment, then hold these for young Eric. A garment made with fabrics from the Garden of Eden, along with a sword, helmet, and shield crafted from steels tempered by the fires of creation. Bjorn said with wide eyes, I suspected such. Will he be allowed to know love and have a family? And Adoniel placed his huge hand upon Bjorn's shoulder with an assuring smile and said, None but the Father knows the times or the events when we will be called upon.
Many in our ranks chose service from the start, and many were given a chance, such as you, and many gave their lives. Now go, enjoy every moment, and embrace life and your family until you are again called upon.
And with that, he stepped back and shot upwards in a shaft of light so bright, Bjorn covered his angelic eyes. Now Bjorn patiently waited at home when Lizzy and Eric arrived. He met them in a yard, and Eric could not believe his eyes when his father unfurled his wings. He now stood 7 feet tall and with huge broad shoulders and radiant blue eyes. Lizzy threw herself into his arms and proclaimed, "My guardian angel has returned." Bjorn said,
"Come, my son, do not be afraid."
Eric embraced his father and asked if he would be like this form from now on.
"No, Eric, you may only see me as such for a moment. Then I will revert to my human form until once again called upon."
"Are you the large man in my dreams, father?"
"No, son, but when the time comes, you will meet him, as did I, and you will be given a choice. But until that day, we work, we train, we love, and we pray."
Prologue. The lights within must not be extinguished. Wow. Suddenly another one. Wow. Absolutely chest-pounding, riveting, intense story there, as it always is, each and every time from my brother, the incredible RICOstories. I honestly can't thank you enough, Rico, for your patience and your dedication to the channel. I know it's been a testing few months and lack of communication, and what has probably tested your thoughts towards the channel and loyalty to myself. But from the bottom of my heart, I really do thank you so much for believing in myself and continuing to write these incredible adventures. Of course, I hope yourself and your family are doing really well. I'm enjoying the start of the brand new year and enjoyed my attempt to bring life to your work once again, as you always have. Thank you. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Now, of course, if you can pen a story packing that much punch, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. And I really look forward to hearing from you. Hold tight for the next installment out of 3 of this incredible series, guys, and a few other sci-fi based stories that Rico has shot over to myself in the last few months. Once again, a mighty thank you to each and every one of you for your likes, comments and shares, and your continued support and dedication to this channel. I hope you're all well and happy and are taking a fight back to life. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.